developed in collaboration with all the partners from Big Four, Gartner, and Salloum Partners to tackle the most pressing topics in the COVID-19 era. Today, we'll discuss how impacted businesses from COVID-19 can manage employment relationships under the UAE law, a topic that we believe concerns the whole business community in the UAE as it covers the overall workforce in the country. Since its first appearance in late December 2019, the pandemic has affected every single aspect of doing business. And on top of the list is the employment relationships. We have seen a sharp rise in global unemployment rates, and that's normal as companies everywhere tend to survive. In the United States alone, the total filings for unemployment claims during the pandemic have hit a record high of 38.6 million. No doubt, these significant shifts in unemployment worldwide derived implications and complexities to the relationship between employers and employees, and accordingly, proper mitigating actions are expected by decision makers to minimize its impact. As we are used to the proactive measures of the government of the UAE to any arising matter, the UAE was among the leading countries in its prompt response to the issue, and the credit goes to the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation, who from the early days of the pandemic have released a number of regulations relating to the matter, namely regulations number 279, 280, and 281 of 2020. The purpose of these regulations was to put a legal framework in place for regulating the employment relationship between the employers and employees during these temporary disrupting times, and to balance between the rights and obligations of both parties, whilst giving a chance to companies impacted by the precautionary measures to try to maintain the retention of its talent, as well as to give a chance to impacted employees to secure their continuity at work or dismissal of it at fair terms. Whether you are an employer or an employee, you certainly have doubts to what's right or wrong, or in other words, to what's legal or illegal in terms of actions relating to the employment relationship under the precautionary measures. Whether you are eligible or entitled to taking paid annual leave, unpaid annual leaves, salary reductions, and many other concerns will be covered today by Ziad Salloum. Ziad is a partner at Salloum Partners, a boutique law firm which was founded 4 decades ago in 1980 by his father, Mr. Ziad Salloum. Mr. Samir Salloum, excuse me. Mr. Samir, or Abu Ziad, as I would like to call him, has received more than 24 international recognition and awards for his distinguished services and civil achievements, mainly from Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, and Vatican, to name few, and lately has been awarded by the Embassy of the Republic of Lebanon in recognition of over 40 years of dedicated and distinguished services and contributions to the business community in the UAE. As they say, like father, like son, Ziad has also in turn received a number of international governmental and other awards for his distinguished services and achievements, notably from the Sorbonne University and the Vatican, and most recently in 2018 was named the leading employment law attorney of the year by Acquisition International. The firm itself has also received a number of prestigious awards and recognition, which is a long list to mention, so I'm going to leave it here to Ziad to step in and kick off the presentation. And please remember to share with us your questions in the Q&A box, as Ziad will try to address the majority of it during the last 15 minutes of the session. Ziad, no pressure at all, but the number of audience so far only on the English session is 350, like almost 350, and I believe the Arabic session as well is quite a good number. So good luck.
Thanks very much, Sultan. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And I hope that you'll find this presentation interesting. And without further ado, let's get started. Let's see, there we go. So yeah, that's us. Like Sultan mentioned, we've been here since 1980. This year, we would have liked to celebrate and do a massive 40 years, but you know, I guess we're gonna have to table that for the time being. So as you know, like Sultan mentioned, in December 2019, the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the disease that it causes, COVID-19, caused essentially seismic upheaval across the globe. And at the beginning of this year, the WHO declared the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. It's unfortunately the UAE has not been spared. There's virtually every single country, 216 territories, states, and countries around the world have been hit. Over 7.5 million cases as of today worldwide. And we've all seen the impact this has had on our daily lives and our families, not to mention UAE society as a whole. I hope everyone is safe and those around you and your families are all doing well and are safe and healthy. And I know some of you have not been able to see family who are abroad. It's been a difficult time for virtually everybody, but I hope going forward, things are going to get easier. And one big positive in all this is that the UAE government's action on this has been extremely swift and so very well in advance of so many other countries around the world. And I think in doing so, they've saved countless lives. So one of the things you'll find throughout this is that the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation seems to have coordinated everything together with the other government departments, because they also likewise took action relatively swiftly. So we're going to be looking at the legal implications of the pandemic within the framework that the Ministry of Human Resources has put into place for us to study. And the second bit will be addressing some of the more common misconceptions about UAE employment law as a whole. We can close off with some Q&A, like Sultan mentioned. I'll take a look at some of the questions in the chat box down the line. A quick note is that of the 3 core resolutions that the Ministry of Human Resources has come out with, so Resolution 279, 280, 281, one of them, which is 280, deals with the employment of UAE citizens. This will not be the focus of our discussion. I mean, the Resolution 280 deals with the setup of a committee that's going to study this and maintain the stability of employment of UAE nationals in the private sector. And their ambit includes the setup of support packages and so on and so forth. But for our purposes, I think the core will be to look at matters dealing with employment of expatriates. So with that, let's get cracking. These are some of the questions that we're going to be addressing throughout the presentation. This first part, at the very least, there are 1 or 2 additional questions, and obviously, you know, if you come up with additional ones, we can see what we can cover down the line. Like we mentioned, the ministry has issued quite a few resolutions. The core are 279 for our purposes, 279 and 281, and most likely we're going to be addressing 279 in particular. That's going to be our focus, because that's going to be the one providing the legal framework of how businesses can be dealing with employees. The 280 deals more with, 281 deals more with the application of the precautionary measures. We will cover some of those, but on a very high level, if you like. The more legal questions arise or come up around 279. Now you'll note that these resolutions all came out towards the end of March, so that's fairly early on. Just as many businesses were starting to ask themselves what they could do to kind of mitigate the impact, the ministry came out with something that provides a sort of a framework for them to be able to look at things. Now, a quick note you'll find as we go down this, you're going to see that the resolutions don't really add or change what's already existing in the employment law, with the exception of a few items that we will touch upon, and I will highlight the differences. But virtually everything else that the resolution discussed are things that people can do, or have the possibility of doing in general under UAE employment law. For example, one of the items that's discussed is the temporary reduction of pay, or a permanent reduction of pay for employees. Both those items are things that are already possible under the existing framework. It's just that there's no particular mechanism that addresses it directly. And by issuing these resolutions, the ministry has confirmed that there is a systemic problem. There is a problem that warrants particular attention. And they've sought to give comfort to both companies and businesses in general and employees, and to provide, let's say, something solid, a solid framework that they could use in dealing with this going forwards. So if we move on to the very first question on the list that I had, it's what if an employee contracts COVID-19? Are they entitled to sick leave? So for this, we have to look back at the employment law. Article 83 will tell you that employees are entitled to sick leave for up to 90 days in any given year. So that includes 15 days at full pay, 30 days at half pay, and the balance 5 days without pay. Now, before I move on to the next sub-question on this, it's also worth asking, well, what if the employee is required to self-quarantine during this period due to a suspected infection? They're not sick yet, at least until the test results come back, and they may not, and the test results may come back and they may be negative. Well, are they entitled to their salary? So there are the questions. There it's going to very much depend as to whether or not the employee is able to work from home. If they're able to work from home, then it's arguable that the employee can continue doing what they're supposed to be doing from home without actually showing up to the office, and therefore there shouldn't be any impact to pay or to anything else until and unless, God forbid, they're supposed to be admitted to hospital for treatment. Now, if they're unable to work during the period of time and they have to be stuck at home for the 14 days until the test results come back and all that stuff, then yes, it's arguable that you could consider it sick leave and it would fall within Article 83 and the treatment there. So that would be my 2 cents on that point. So if we look at the other item with what if they, because the basic idea here is a person falls sick on their own. Well, what if they contract a disease because they failed to follow the employer's guidelines or the government's own safety guidelines that as have been imposed within the business itself? There is a question mark as to whether or not they would be entitled to sick leave if they were extremely negligent in the way they behaved that led to them contracting the disease itself. Obviously this is not something that's easy to prove. So and then there's also a human element. So perhaps a strict application or a theoretical point may not be very helpful to a lot of businesses in tackling this bit. Moving on. Can an employer compel its employees to take paid annual leave? We're going to split the look at annual leave, paid annual leave, and unpaid leave separately. So here we're talking about paid leave, their annual holiday. Now, the UAE employment law at Article 76 basically provides that an employer has the right to at any time determine the time and the duration of annual leave in general. The only restriction on this power granted to employers is that the employer cannot split the annual leave period into more than 2. So this is something that's an absolute right given to the employer, but the resolution here says that you've got the employer and the employee can together agree, or they need to agree whether or not whether annual leave would be taken here at this point. So that probably provides or allows for much more flexibility in dealing with matters of annual leave. So for example, if an employer wishes to apply annual leave on a rotational basis, so that, for example, an employee could be working for 3 days in a week and the remaining 2 days would be part of their annual leave. So those are things that in principle under Article 76 you may not be able to do, because as an employer you cannot impose that. But together with the agreement of the parties, the agreement of the employer and the employee, you can of course agree to virtually anything you wish, any setup you wish to be able to adapt to this setup, to the new, the very different and very real implications that this pandemic has had on businesses worldwide, and in the UAE in particular. So a question arises then is, what if there's no sufficient annual leave balance available? Well, different businesses have come up with different mechanisms in which to tackle this bit. So if you don't have annual leave available, well, one line of thought would be to say, well, then we'll start applying unpaid leave. That again has its own issues, which we'll talk about shortly. Another alternative some businesses have come up with is that they will apply the following year. So the balances that would be available in 2021, sorry, and apply them in this year and allow employees to avail of those future leaves today. So there's a lot of flexibility that's been given to employers and employees to try and manage the complexities and the issues that are arising today, and allow businesses to take to basically be able to revisit the way they work and they do businesses without having to resort to extreme measures. And I think as a trend, we'll find this throughout what's called, I think most companies will have already experienced this, that this is not, there's very little pushback, let's say, on the part of employees, simply because employees understand what's at stake here. If the companies or the businesses survive, the employees will retain their employment and so on and so forth. Everybody understands within the entire UAE community that we have to band together. It's this pandemic has been the great unifier in a certain sense, not just locally, but worldwide. And it's brought to the fore the number of businesses around us who have been able to reach and put into place systems and mechanisms that work, that allow the business to survive, and with the immediate and direct consent of employees and the buy-in of employees, is astounding. It's a testament to the fact that everybody understands that they have a common interest in this, and that putting these measures in place will allow everybody to benefit down the line in the long term, and that the primary goal is survival today. So can an employer compel their employees to take unpaid leave? Like we've been saying so far, it's not about compelling people to take it, it's not about an imposition. Compelling any employee is not going to really work or assist. The resolution 279 of the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation, I'll just call it the ministry here going forwards, it always acts on a central idea that you need consent of the employee at every stage. So if you wish to implement a remote working system, then you need consent. If you wish to grant paid leave, like we were talking about earlier, and it's not within the framework of Article 76, which allows you to split let's say unilaterally require employees to take annual leave in bulk. If you want to do a rotational plan, you need consent. If you want to grant unpaid leave or require people to take unpaid leave, you need their acceptance to implement this. And the same for temporary salary reductions, and the same for the permanent salary reductions, which we'll cover shortly. So the issue of consent is core and key and is central to everything that the ministry has put into place. So because there's no express provision in the employment law that really tackles the issue of unpaid leave, this Article 2.3 has allowed or put into place a framework that permits or grants companies the ability to put this up as an option within the idea of safeguarding businesses during this difficult time. So because you've got consent of the employees required, it's if you like, how to put it, it's this approach or this provision has allowed companies to, in effect, impose a reduction on pay for certain employees without actually going out and cutting pay. So psychologically, it makes a massive difference. It also allows businesses to be able to inform their employees to stay at home and not work because there is a reduction in business, or the businesses themselves are unable to continue working. So obviously events are going to be markedly different from one type of business activity to another. And the important thing is for businesses to be able to recognize where employees need to stay on board and where employees can be, or the business is forced to ask employees to stay home. And as long as you have buy-in from the employees, I think everything else is relatively straightforward going down. So can you unilaterally impose a salary reduction? Again, it's nothing in this resolution allows a business to do anything unilaterally. this is going to be a recurring theme. So I think at this point, I'm going to stop harping on that particular subject, and we'll just kind of carry on simply and straightforwardly. So the ministry in Article 2 has allowed companies to either temporarily or permanently reduce salaries. If you have a temporary salary reduction, the ministry has put into place a particular framework that allows you to do this. So the ministry has on its website a sample contract that you could use that can bring that you can apply and sign, and you can set a fixed duration for the salary reduction. You mention what it is, and it becomes a supplement to your original employment contract. Now, that remains internal. It doesn't necessarily need to be submitted to the ministry, but the ministry may require it at some point in time. So it would be a good idea to have it and put it into place to make sure that everybody's rights are protected. Now, Article 5 here, it will tell you that it makes a mention that this temporary supplement, the duration is whatever has been set out in the supplement itself, or the period of the resolution itself, the period of application of the resolution, which obviously we know is going to be uncertain, because it very much depends on the impact, on how long the impact of the pandemic is felt, and what measures may need to be required going forward, which hopefully we're going to start seeing the end of soon. So if your duration expires, if your agreed duration of, let's say, 2 months, it expires before this resolution comes to a close, comes to an end, then you're going to, and you need to extend it, and the business is forced to extend it in one form or another, then they'll need to agree with the employee an extension, and agree for, a different, an additional time frame with an additional supplement to it. Some businesses may, if they wish, from the very beginning, agree with the employee that, if depending on the circumstances of the business, there is room to say that, yeah, they can agree to an initial duration, and then it can be extended for, let's say, additional periods of 1 month or so, depending on the needs of the business. So prior agreement of an employee is not, let's say, to any further extension is not necessarily unheard of, and maybe it should be possible. What about a permanent cut? Well, Article 6 of the resolution, it requires employers to obtain the approval of the ministry via the conditions for contract amendment as might be in force at that moment in time. An important item, like we were saying before, this resolution comes, if you like, supplementing the law. So we have to fall back on the law itself as a guide. And in general parlance, if you wish to have a permanent cut to salary, we would suggest that you have to terminate the old contract entirely. That means pay out any accrued annual leaves, any accrued end of service, and start a completely fresh contract, anew, and without a link between the old and the new. And this is particularly true if there's going to be a change to the basic salary of an employee, or to any other allowances that would form part of the remuneration used for calculation of end of service benefits. It's extremely important that this be done to avoid and minimize conflict down the line between the parties. So we will talk more about some of the misconceptions about how you calculate end of service benefits towards the end of this this seminar. But this is as a general guidance, this would be the best approach to take. I appreciate that, one of the reasons businesses would want to put in place things of this nature is because there is a cash shortage for the business. But this can be resolved in different ways, in multiple ways, depending on the circumstances. The core has to be that you should not link the two contracts together in any way, shape, or form. So other questions to consider when you go down this is, what is going to be the impact on end of service benefits, like we were saying? Well, can you, if you're going to be imposing any reductions in pay, whether it's temporary or permanent, can you limit them to the allowances bits and not to the basic pay, so that the end of service is not affected? What is, if you're putting in place a temporary salary cut, what is going to be the impact on your annual leave? If anybody requests annual leave now, or if you agree with employees that people would either take them in bulk or on a rotational basis or so on. What if people request for their annual leaves to be encashed during the period of application of any cuts? There's an additional item, and that's the impact of these cuts. How does this affect things where some staff within a business receive allowances on a monthly basis, let's say housing allowance on a monthly basis, and other members of the same entity receive this as in bulk, a one-time or let's say you know, two biannual or quarterly payment, you know, where basically the business is paying the housing allowance directly to the landlord at the time, at the applicable time periods during the life of a tenancy contract. Those are serious questions, and those are not things that you're going to find an answer to directly in the resolutions. We would suggest that, you know, the businesses, when they decide, if and when they decide to put things like this in place with the agreement of the employees, that they think of these items ahead of time, and that they incorporate answers to all of this in whatever guidance they're going to be providing to employees for this period. So there are some relatively simple and straightforward things that can be taken into account. So for example, if you know, the guidance to employees can, for instance, say that any annual leave that an employee might take during the period of application of a cut would be at the reduced salary rate rather than the original rate prior to, or the, you know, the complete and comprehensive rate prior to the application of the cut. Those are, you know, a business can try to limit or minimize the impact on the end of service by either ensuring that the reductions are only limited to allowances, or if the cut is so large as to necessitate a cut to basic salary as well, that they put into their guidance that if a person is terminated or leaves during the period of application of the cut, that the method or mechanism of calculation of the end of service benefits would not be affected, as in it would remain calculated on the total prior to the cut. Obviously, in this instance, we're talking about a temporary cut and not a permanent one, because that bit's already been addressed previously. If it's a permanent cut, you sign a completely fresh contract, you cut off the prior employment relationship, and everything that is owed and due to an employee should get paid off at that moment in time at the beginning, prior to moving on to the new employment relationship at the reduced levels. So thinking of all the issues that can go wrong and trying to address them ahead of time and early will facilitate getting buy-in from employees, and will obviously make sure that everybody's rights are adequately protected in a way that makes sense for all, and minimizes conflict or potential for conflict down the line, and remains obviously within the framework of the law. So a big question we get asked is, well, what if an employee refuses a salary reduction, whether it's a permanent one or a temporary one? Then we have to, again, go back and look at the provisions of the UAE employment law. One of the first questions that should be asked is this employee under probation? And if they're under probation, then a business has the option to let them go without requirement for notice and without requirement for any reason. In every other instance, or particularly if we're talking about unlimited term contracts, if you link the two together, if you link the dismissal with the refusal to accept a salary reduction or refusal to accept to take paid leave or unpaid leave, any of the other measures that that Ministerial Resolution 279 has provided as a framework, then a business is probably looking at a claim for unfair dismissal with with a potential claim for 3 months of remuneration on top of any notice period that's applicable at that moment in time for that under that employee's employment contract. It's key that you should not be linking, or businesses should not be linking, the dismissals with the salary reduction or any of the other methods and mechanisms. Obviously, businesses would be or should be looking to reward those employees who do show some loyalty at this point in time, or who realize or understand the gravity of the situation, and who are active participants, and to try and help businesses stay on their feet. So that could be, by studying bonuses or salary raises down the line once things go back to normal. So those employees who refuse these reductions or to apply any of these measures, well, obviously they would probably fare less well eventually once the business gets back on its feet. I'm going to stress on this bit a bit more, because the dismissals, especially for unlimited term contracts, they need to be for a valid reason. And a valid reason has been typically understood by the courts to be a reason related to the work of the employee or to the business itself. So, for example, now a question now has been asked is, well, would the financial health of the business at this point in time qualify as a valid reason? There is enough to say, or there may be enough to say at this point in time, given the extent of the pandemic, that yes, the financial health of the company might be considered a valid reason, but it's going to very much depend on how the notice of termination is worded, and the phrasing, the language used therein. So that's why if you tie any dismissal to the refusal, you're facing you're going to be facing a claim for unfair dismissal, abusive termination, in other words. For a limited term employment contract, it becomes a lot more difficult to, in all events, to let the person go. Because they are bound by a fixed term. So unless there is consent of the employee to terminate the contract, you have their agreement at this point to terminate, or you pay them the greater of 3 months of pay, or the amount of pay due to them. Sorry, the lesser of 3 months of pay, or the remainder of the pay for the remainder of the term. So let's say a month and a half are left over before the end of the employment, you have to pay out the entire month and a half as compensation for this early termination. So it's the lesser of the remainder of the term, or 3 months of pay. Unless, of course, you have a reason to terminate an employee under Article 120 of the employment law, which deals with things like fraud or intentional damage to property and so on and so forth. Those we can tackle. We can tackle some of these ideas down the line. So, no, we've talked about some of this stuff already. So, Article 122 of the employment law, it does provide you all this stuff. I'm not going to reread any of this stuff because we've already talked about the majority of all this. It just kind of repeats much of this. So there you go. Under Article 113 and 115 of the employment law, at the end for the limited term, you'll need to either wait until expiry of the contract or mutual consent and so on. So if you do have any questions on this, I'll take a look at them down the line. I know this is a thorny topic for some, application of what constitutes an unlimited term, limited term. We're going to tackle some of this stuff down the line, but it's worth highlighting here. So, can an employer compel their employees to present themselves at work? The short answer is yes. You have a very specific provision in Resolution 281 that talks about this. Actually, it does require employees to report to the workplace whenever requested. That's in the 3rd article, subsection 2 of it. But obviously, the employer needs to abide by government guidelines as well. an employee needs to feel kind of safe. I understand that, particularly in this current environment, a lot of employees are worried about their own health or the health of other members of their family, particularly if those other members are at risk. But in general, an employer can require an employee to come back to the office, provided obviously there's no government guideline requiring people to stay home. Now, one key item to bear in mind is that businesses should limit the number of employees at the workplace, at least during the application of these measures, these preventative measures, to 30% of their workforce. So the ministry itself, though, clarified that this requirement does not necessarily apply to those in particular field of activity, those who are deemed, if you wish, essential activities. So that includes financial sectors, healthcare providers at the core, and then water, electricity, sewerage, telecommunications, so utilities generally, and then infrastructure, road and bridge works, and so on and so forth. There's a longer list, but in brief, these are the ones that I think are going to speak to most people. So you need to take into account the lockdown measures that are being put into place in any given emirate. So for example, a few weeks ago, Dubai was completely locked down. Today, at this point in time, you have measures that are currently in place that cover Abu Dhabi more than elsewhere. So if you have employees who are in Dubai and you need them in Abu Dhabi to work, well, obviously that's not going to be possible at this point in time. So bearing everything else in mind, the general principle is yes, an employer can require employees to return to work. Obviously, employers should bear in mind that people, we are all human, and some people will be worried for their health and their safety, or they and I think businesses should prioritize as far as possible obviously this is not a legal point, this is more maybe a personal item. Businesses should try and prioritize that employees who are above the age of 60 or who have underlying conditions that end up being most at risk for contracting or for having serious health issues if they contract the disease, that those people be prioritized to remain at home. And similarly, if their employees have family members who are in those fit in within those categories. So what are the preventative or other measures that an employer should implement at the workplace? If we look back, before we look at Resolution 281, if we look at Article 91 of the Employment Law, well, that already requires that every employer provides adequate preventative equipment to protect employees against occupational diseases. Now, typically, here in this framework, we were talking about probably industry, construction, oil and gas, energy, that sort of thing. Basically, any industry or the medical sector or whatnot, any industry in which there are health hazards already. I think very few people would have imagined that we would be talking about something of this nature, or we would be talking about this in the context of a global pandemic. But still, you have that requirement already there. So it is a requirement on businesses to provide adequate preventative equipment. So an employee has a corresponding duty to use this equipment properly, and they should be complying with any instructions given by the employer in that respect. So what safety equipment can we talk about here? Okay, I've just realized that we've got about 3 or 4 minutes, so I'm gonna try and rush through them. I don't really have that many other things before we move on to misconceptions, so I'll try and cover this quite quickly. So essentially, I think at this stage, you've got the guidance of the ministry itself, but which provides for all the necessary tools to be able to work at home. If you can work from home, encourage people to do so. And then if they are required to work from the office, then at the very least you should have temperature check at entry and at exit from the office, and require obsessive, if you wish, regular and proper hand washing as the best way to protect, not to mention the face masks, which are necessary and required. So is it enough to put these things in place? Is it enough to say, well, hey, you have a washroom you can use, you can go wash your hands? That one is a bit of a it's a bit of a question mark. It's going to very much depend on the nature and the circumstances of each individual business and the lines of work that they're in, and how close people get in, basically how close people end up working together. And the core is looking at Article 2 of Resolution 281. This is going to be this is a list of the items that are mandated by the resolution to try and implement the safety measures at the workplace. So one of the key items, I would say, out of all this stuff that's here is you need to make sure that you have a business continuity plan in place, that you have business critical infrastructure that is set up and running. And if you wish, there is an excellent guide, a business continuity readiness guide that has been issued by the ministry itself, and it's available for download from the ministry's website. And I think that would be that's an excellent place to start if your business has not actually put into place any business critical infrastructure or any business continuity plan at this point in time. The rest are excellent guidelines and measures that people can take into account to make sure that things are that people are safe in the workplace. And with that, we were going to be jumping into common misconceptions, but I see that my time is pretty much run out. I guess that a lot of items will be covered by your questions, and maybe we can tackle them there. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention on this bit, and I'll just cycle all the way down to the end. Oop, there we go. And let's see if I can find where the chat window is. I can take a look at some of your questions.
Yeah, indeed, Ziad. Like we have received, I would say, more than 20 questions. That's only on the English session. As well, there are a couple of questions in the Arabic session. So I believe like we'll try our best to go on most of those. So try, if possible, to limit your questions to like keep it very simple and very brief, so we can probably address the concerns of most of our audience. So I'm gonna start with the first one. Can employer change employment contract terms from full-time to part-time?
Again, all of this is with the consent of the employee. So in principle, yes, but there's obviously, this is not something that's specifically covered under the framework that the ministry issued under Resolution 279. But like we were saying before, there's nothing that stops you from doing that in any event. But you do need agreement between the two. It cannot be an imposition just directly.
Okay, so that brings me to another question. So what happens if the employee says no, since the consent is required?
Yeah, I think we covered that to an extent. You can't terminate the employee for that reason, right? So if they say no, they say no, and you continue in principle with the same circumstances and package and everything else. Obviously, that's not going to play in the employee's favor down the line, which is what I was saying previously. So, if an employee doesn't realize the circumstances and unique circumstances that we're in today, then something needs to be taken a look at. Yeah.
Okay. Another question: if an employer terminates a staff member in their probation period, is the employer still liable to pay housing for that employee until they leave the UAE or find another job?
And I think that's looking at Article 3 of the Resolution 279. This article, I think, has been the subject of quite a bit of debate. My personal reading is that this only applies to those businesses that have been affected by the precautionary measures, in the sense like restaurants that have been shut down, hotels and whatnot, basically, or retail outlets that have not been able to operate, and they don't necessarily wish to let go of their employees. And so those employees effectively cannot work, and the business doesn't want to let them go, at least not at that initial stage during the time of the precautionary measures. So this article has allowed employers to basically put these employees up onto the ministry employment website, so to speak, and allows and a mechanism has been put into place to allow businesses to hire those employees either on a temporary basis or on a full-time basis while this measure is in place. Now, if it's a full-time basis, obviously at that moment in time, the employer will relinquish sponsorship of that employee to the new employer, and people carry on on their way. But this is not, I don't believe this article, my reading, this is not, does not relate to employees who have been terminated. I hope that addresses that.
Yeah. So what if employee is affected with COVID-19 and he's still under probation period? As per law, is he or she entitled to for sick leave?
That's a good question, actually. I'll have to, if I recall, hold on, I'm gonna have to look this up. There we go. Yeah, sick leave, typically there are conditions for the application of sick leave. I believe it's 6 months after, if I'm not mistaken, which I'm gonna have to take a look at again, because I cannot remember everything in the.
No problems. Yeah, we're gonna anyway.
I can come back to this afterwards if you wish.
Yeah, there will be a couple of questions which we'll cover post the session, as we've mentioned earlier. So, what's the maximum percentage of salary reduction that an employer can apply to an employee? Is it related to the percentage of work conducted, or well, it's irrelevant?
The resolution hasn't actually mentioned this, so I would hazard to guess, to come out and make a guess on this bit.
Okay, so for those who are stranded abroad and can work remotely, what are their legal rights regarding payroll entitlement and employment benefits?
Well, if
I believe some of those you've already covered, but I mean, just to for the sake of mentioning most of the questions that have been raised by the audience.
Yeah, I think this question can be unpacked into two separate sections. So the first is the one that you mentioned, which is employees able to work remotely. And so if he's able to work remotely, then and you don't require him on site, then they shouldn't be affected by any of this. Their employment should continue normally, and their salary would continue being paid in a normal manner. The bigger issue is going to be, what if the employee is stuck abroad and he can't work and he's required on site? So let's say, I don't know, somebody who needs to be physically on site to do what it is that they're supposed to be doing. What do you do with those? Well, you could say that under Article 273 of the Civil Transactions Law, this could constitute an force majeure event that would say there's an impossibility of the contract to continue. Or, on a different reading, you could say there's partial or temporary impossibility. In either case, the employer or the employee is allowed to basically terminate that contract on that basis. Obviously, that's not the best, most desired result, and I know that most of the companies around us are actually looking for ways in which they can mitigate this, because they do wish the employment relationship to continue.
Okay. Is it true that salaries below 4,000 are exempted from the reduction? Like, is there a ceiling for salaries before a reduction is allowed?
I think the ministry, like I said earlier, the ministry doesn't address a specific ceiling or provide a cap. So those items are, unless there's a subsequent clarification that will come from the ministry on that, there's nothing directly in that resolution that addresses this point.
Okay. Is the COVID sick leave different from the general sick leave?
I would say at this point, no. We fall back if there isn't an answer in any resolution or regulation that's been put out by any government organ. Our fallback is always to go look in the law, the basic law, and then there's nothing specific that addresses sick leave or that differentiates sick leave between COVID-19 and the law. So we go back to the main law.
Okay. So is there any difference in applying Article 5 of Resolution 279 between Abu Dhabi and other Emirates? In Dubai in particular?
This is about temporary, this is the temporary employment, a temporary reduction of pay for non-nationals. Yeah, the temporary supplement is the same. The supplement can be extracted from the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization, and it's the one document that applies across the UAE. The ministry is a federal one, after all.
Okay. So, sorry, I'm going so quick because I want to cover as much possible of the questions. And believe it or not, I don't think we're going to cover all because it's a huge list. So, if there is a mutual agreement between an employer and employee, does it have to be like submitted to the ministry, or if they have that confirmed via, let's say, another communication like through email confirmation, would that be fine, or it has to be submitted to Mohri?
No, I think the only items that the ministry has wanted expressly to see, they've set out in the resolution. So that's essentially been limited to the situation of a permanent salary reduction where you have to sign a completely fresh contract and re-register that with the ministry itself. Everything else virtually, whether it is the remote working system, the paid sick leave, the paid leave, annual leave, or the unpaid leave, temporary reduction, and so on. Those are all governed essentially by the businesses and the employees themselves. Communication of any kind, written communication of any kind, should be more than enough. If there's a guidance that's been issued, obviously we do recommend that you have everything signed or confirmed by way of a signed document between the employee and the employer, just to avoid any potential conflicts. But written communication should suffice.
Okay, so having said so, if the addendum is done but is not submitted, this will not basically impose the company to any fines or being blocked.
Oh, right. This is the maybe a point of clarification. Sorry, the temporary salary reduction should be evidenced, and there is a requirement for the supplement to be put into place. So that's maybe one of the only items where you do need to have a supplement, a supplementary document, and you can get that from the ministry website itself. That can be signed internally between the employee and the employer, and then it should be provided to the ministry only if the ministry requires it.
Okay, I have two questions on notice periods. So, are companies obliged to pay a 3 months dismissal pay, even if they go by the notice period in the contract? That's one. And the other one, like they're probably common. An unlimited term contract states that any party can fire or resign given 1 month notice. Does this need a valid reason to implement it?
Sorry, could you come again, the second bit?
So an unlimited term contract states that any party can fire or resign giving 1 month notice. Yep. Does this need a valid reason to implement it?
Well, from the employer side, from the employee side, they can terminate. They don't need to necessarily provide a valid reason because they can resign at any time. From the employer side, if they wish to terminate, it needs to be for a valid reason. If we're talking about an unlimited term contract. I think I covered this earlier in the presentation. So yes, it is necessary for it to be a valid reason. There's no valid reason. The term valid reason is not defined in the law, but the consensus is from jurisprudence throughout over the many years that this has been debated, that it has to be linked to the work itself. Yeah. Oh, I can't hear you, Sultan. I lost you.
Sorry, I was on mute. So in case there are confirmed COVID cases in a company, can the employer compel employees to show up at work?
I think this is where we said that the general principle is, yes, you can compel an employee to show up to work, but you need to take into account the government requirements and regulations and the preventative measures. So if somebody is suspected of having contracted COVID-19, they should be undergoing quarantine particularly until the test results come back and so on. So yeah, in principle, you should not be in a position to compel those people to show up. And there's a mandatory requirement for the quarantine, obviously. So yeah, there's a limit to what you can do. You need to bear in mind the preventative measures and the requirements that the government has issued in respect of that sort of thing.
Okay. If an employee is asked to take leave due to the pandemic, but has already taken one part of his or her accrued leave in the employment year, would he or she be entitled to an air ticket to his or her home country?
Air ticket for the for the holiday?
Yeah, I mean, but
Yeah.
if they have already took their annual leave, but they've asked to take another one.
Right. So first question, the first bit that we need to unpack there is whether or not the company's internal policies or the employee's contract actually includes a provision for air ticket for the purpose of holiday coverage of that. If it doesn't, if neither the internal policy or the contract requires it, this is not a mandatory requirement under the law for an annual holiday, and so. In general, so the answer would be no. The other alternative is, well, if you're stuck in the country at this point in time, no one can really travel if he's not on holiday. And the question is, if they do get on a repatriation flight, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be able to come back because those flights are one way. So it's questionable. The purpose of any air ticket for the purpose of a holiday is to allow the employee to travel to the destination in question and to return. So there's a valid question to be raised here as to whether or not the repatriation flights that are being discussed at this moment would qualify for that sort of thing. So in print, there's enough out there to say that those things should not be paid for in this manner, at least. Obviously, we'll have to look at the specifics in every case, but that's the reasoning, I guess, a lot of people might use.
Okay, one last question, Ziad, because we already ran out of time. And then after the question, if you have any conclusion you want to say before I close. So if an employee is asked to home quarantine for 2 weeks because he has been in contact with an infected person, would he or she be entitled for salary pay for the 2 weeks home quarantine if he or she tested positive or negative at one point within the 2 weeks period?
Thanks for asking that. I think I tried to cover that a little bit in the presentation. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear. I think because there's no specific answer to this, the main idea, if you're required to stay at home because there's a chance that a person has contracted COVID-19, then most likely it's going to, if they're unable to work from home during this period in which there would be no change to their employment relationship. If we're assuming the employee needs to be on site to do their work and they're stuck at home, then it should in principle be considered as a sick leave, or there's a very good argument to make that it's sick leave, even though you're not quite sure yet until you get the test results back whether or not the person in question has actually contracted the disease or not. I hope that clarifies.
Any conclusion statement from you, Anzia, before I close? Thanks for your time anyway. I'm sorry for going so quick in the questions, but we haven't covered most of the questions been asked so far.
Well, thanks very much, Sultan. I'm very thankful to the chamber and to all of you for listening as I went through this presentation. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. To close off, I mean, I was born and raised here, so this is home. My kids are born here. This is my country as far as I can, I've seen the UAE go through a lot of things over the time I've been here. So this year, 40 years now. So they've weathered each and every storm, and they've come out stronger at the end of it. All the businesses I've seen around me, people around, and the government itself. I mean, people here are resilient. I think, we're nothing if not resilient. Both residents and citizens, and government will pull through this. And I think the UAE's the government has already shown that it's able to take extremely fast decisions and to act with limited information and to adapt as the information as they gather more information. And I think that means there's a lot of hope basically for a swift recovery once all this is over. And in the meantime, I mean, we're all in this together, and I think that's been very, very clear. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's message, La Chaloun Ham, is very, I think it's been a very powerful one.
Thank you, Ziad, and thanks for the nice closing. I would say, like, we all support this, what you're saying. We have no doubt that the UAE will get out of this stronger and stronger than ever. All what we have to do is to stay positive, stay united, and things will be better soon, hopefully.
Hope so.
I hope for the audience, I hope you all find this helpful. Always remember that the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratization has always been there to elevate the employment standards at the UAE, and we're confident that they apply an open door policy for all concerns of the public. So don't hesitate to contact them shall you have any queries or clarifications. Anyway, we will hopefully have a separate session with the ministry so they can tackle current matters and highlight their other initiatives as well. On Tuesday, we'll cover accounting and disclosure implications of COVID-19, what companies should be doing. Another hot topic of general concern, I would say, that we aim to shed some light on with Yusuf Hassan from KPMG. Before we close, a quick reminder for everyone who haven't yet got the chance to take our survey that's aimed to assess the current and future impacts of the precautionary measures on the private sector in Abu Dhabi. You know that your opinion matters, so appreciate if you spend 5 minutes to complete and submit the survey and leverage this opportunity to make your voice more heard. So, wish to see you all on Tuesday and have a good day. Thank you, Ziad.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Cheers.